Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to give you a brief welcome before we get started. I'm Maya Elenevsky, the Events and Outreach Manager here at the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society with the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. The ACMHE is a multidisciplinary academic association with a membership of over 700 educators, staff, students, and researchers committed to the transformation of higher education through contemplative methods. The ACMHE is an initiative of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. I'd like to welcome you to our November 2019 Contemplative Education webinar, Contemplating 400 Years of Inequality with Angel Acosta. Now I'd like to give you a little background about our presenter. For the last decade, Angel Acosta has worked to bridge the fields of leadership, social justice, mindfulness, and contemplative studies. He is currently finishing his doctorate degree in the Curriculum and Teaching Department at Teachers College, Columbia University. Angel has supported educational leaders and their students by facilitating leadership trainings, creating pathways to higher education, and designing dynamic learning experiences. His dissertation explores healing-centered education as a promising framework for educational leadership development. He is currently an education consultant and former trustee for the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. We are extremely excited to have him with us today. Please welcome Angel.
Welcome, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation and being part of this webinar. I want to take a moment just to recognize everybody who's logged on. We have over 200 people and more trickling in from around the country, some international. So I wanted to acknowledge the time that you're dedicating to just hear some of the insights that are coming out of a really powerful experience that we've been able to curate. So what we're going to be doing today, we're going to dive into this experience that has been, for me, one of the most powerful learning opportunities that I've been able to engage in as a professional. So I wanted to walk you through some of the learning objectives that we will be exploring. Before I do that, I want you to take a moment and just sit. And wherever you are, whether you're at home, at the office, on the road, let's just take a moment just to focus on our breathing. Gently inhaling, gently exhaling. Taking just a couple of minutes to just close your eyes. And deepen your connection with your breath. Let your shoulders relax. Let your chest rise and fall gently. Take some last few deep breaths. And just gently open your eyes. You know, as a contemplative and as a scholar in the field, we know that contemplative practices and mindfulness practices allow us to really cultivate a sense of well-being, to sharpen our ability to pay attention, to reduce the negative impact of stress and the reduction of cortisol. Like those of us who are knee deep in this work know that taking some time to breathe, taking some time to be present is very useful for diving into conversations. And what I've been thinking about is how to use contemplative practices and mindfulness in order to dive into deep conversations. So I want you to take a moment and sit with this image. Gently scan it with your eyes. Notice the images that are scattered throughout the screen. I start with this image because the 400 Years of Inequality project has been working and in place for about 3 years now, originating out of a new school in New York City, composed and constituted by some amazing scholars like Dr. Mindy Fullilove, Robert Fullilove, several other scholars who are doing incredible work in the field of public health, the social justice field, and the mindfulness community. And what the central goal was to think about how we can hold and commemorate the arrival of enslaved Africans to US soil, starting and thinking about the year 1619. So what I'm going to do for the next 40 minutes is really kind of guide you and walk you through my journey supporting the National Committee, the 400 Years of Inequality National Committee, but also the experimentation I've done integrating contemplative practices with deep conversations around structural inequality. So the learning objectives for this webinar are kind of to explore the context that gave rise to the 400 Years of Inequality, kind of review how the timeline has been used and received in different communities throughout the country, experience the timeline digitally. So at some point, I will allow you to just experience the time in digital form. It's very different than seeing it in physical form, but we'll get a taste of how the timeline really kind of sits with us digitally. I'll take this opportunity to kind of explore some of the tensions and that surface in the scholarship, but also in practice when doing this work, and where are some of the future directions that this work may take. I want to give you a little bit of context. I used to be a board member for the Center for Contemplative Mind, and I had a really instrumental role in co-chairing the conference that took place a few years ago. And the theme was radicalizing contemplative education. It was hosted at the Multiversity, and I recall vividly spending a whole year leading and chairing the committee that brought together folks to execute the conference. And I start here because this was an incredible opportunity for me to really get a sense for how the field of contemplative education was going to integrate social justice and the notions of intersectionality and multiple identities. And it really shaped how I began to have more robust conversations around this work. And beautifully, the tensions that came up throughout that planning process and the incredible synergies that unfolded as well resulted in me kind of committing to deepening my practice on the one hand, but also the integration of contemplative practices, specifically for having difficult conversations. So this work is really scholar. I'm finishing my doctorate degree right now at Columbia University, and my research really thinks about healing and contemplative practice as being one kind of vehicle for generating healing. I also want to kind of acknowledge that we are right now, as a country specifically, but as a globe more generally, are going through an incredible transition. There's incredible levels of turbulence that are being felt across different communities. On a broad kind of ecological level, we have the climate crisis that has been produced and generated by human activity and our kind of struggle to find equilibrium and reduce climate change. We have structural inequality in terms of the widening income gap that is present in the US in particular. And we have an incredible evolution in terms of technology where we are at the point where our computer processing speed has surpassed any calculation in regards to their development, whereby companies like Google are now claiming that they've reached quantum supremacy, and artificial intelligence and other technologies that are emerging are evolving at such a rapid rate, so that right now we are kind of going through an incredible transition. And it's important to point it out that there's incredible levels of turbulence. On top of that, just to be clear, there is this kind of emotional current of polarization in the country. And you can see it on the political level, but also on the streets and in communities. Over the last, you could say, 5-10 years, you have the emergence of all kinds of movements that have surfaced the angsts of particular communities. If you look at these images, they represent different manifestations of particular social forces in our society across the last several years. You have on the top left, you have the response to the murder of innocent civilians at the hands of law enforcement in Baltimore and the uprisings that gave rise to that. You can name so many other citizens like Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, who on some levels have become martyrs in this larger movement to support and uphold and allow Black lives to matter. You have the upsurge and the powerful energy that came out of the Me Too movement on the top right, and then the sit-ins and the sit-ins that came out of the immigration reform movement. And lastly, just to point out the rise and the surge of white nationalism, and that in the image below to the left really is encapsulated by what happened at University of Virginia a few years ago. So I want to start here just to recognize the incredible level of complexity that is unfolding before us. And here comes the 400 Years of Inequality project, aiming to, like the New York Times 1619 project, to curate a space, curate information that would allow the country to reckon with its past, reckon with its history, so that it is directly connected to other initiatives throughout the country to reflect on our lineage and our ancestry. What I want to do now is I want to make sure that I honor the committee's work. So I'm going to read to you a document, or a part of a document that was produced by the 400 Years of Inequality Planning Committee. And I want to read it to you because it'll give you a sense of how bold the committee was in terms of articulating the importance of commemorating 400 years of inequality, this 400-year period. So let me read this to you. We call on everyone to prepare observances for the 400th anniversary of the arrival in 1619 at Jamestown of the first Africans to be sold into bondage. These Africans were the first of millions that followed as slaves to work on plantations and established on land stolen from the indigenous peoples of this continent. Colonialism and slavery were soon codified into laws, promoting inequality and legitimating oppression and terror. These laws and the practices they encouraged were and remain formidable barriers against efforts by Native Americans, African Americans, poor whites, and numerous other groups to unite against the dispossession and occupation of lands and exploitative and oppressive life and work conditions. Some 100 years after the beginning of the trade in humans, principles that explicitly and emphatically contradicted structures of inequality and dehumanization were enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. Years later, however, the Constitution would advance one of the most pernicious accountings of human worth by asserting that slaves, counted as only 3/5 of a person. The contradiction and hypocrisy evident in the founding documents is manifest today as an elaborate network of social and economic, political and spiritual divisions that produce ever more elaborate forms of inequality. This accounting of personhood established in the Constitution diminishes the humanity of vast groups of people while elevating others to the status of natural supremacy. This ledger of worth and legitimacy constrains all of our lives, including the lives of oppressors, for it is spiritually impoverished and forecloses the building of diverse, caring, joyful, and free communities. We need desperately to link arms in radical equality. Starting now, we can renew and strengthen the long struggle for full emancipation, equity, and justice by coming together to remember the events at Jamestown and the pernicious and persistent devaluing of persons that has been a central structure of human history, of US history. We need to unify, account for the past, and assume the rights and responsibilities for the future of all if we are to meet the challenges ahead. These challenges include climate change, decaying physical infrastructure, rapidly evolving jobs, underperforming schools, uneven access to healthcare, and a lack of affordable housing. We call on everyone to prepare observances for the 400th anniversary of Jamestown. We do this to denounce structures of inequality. We do this to foreground our fundamental and unconditional equality. We remember, and in doing so, we refuse to participate and reproduce structures of dehumanization, exploitation, oppression, and inequity. This is the call to observance, written by the 400 Years of Inequality National Organizing Committee. And it is a document that is read during each observance. And what the call invited the country to do was essentially to welcome communities throughout the country to have their own place-based observances of this 400-year period. And as I'll share later, we will look at the website to look at some of the resources. And this actual call is on their website, and you can use it to either opening an observance or in your classes. But I just wanted you to get a sense of how powerful the communication that came out of the committee was in terms of its precise call for us to really reckon with our past. I also want to take a moment to recognize that the C-Mind community has all kinds of expertise. that's available to us. These are some of the texts that really inform some of this work and some of the ways that I approach the conversation, from folks like Lara Rendon, writing Senti Pensante, Beth Barilla, with her wonderful book on integrating mindfulness and anti-oppression pedagogy, wonderful Rhonda McGee, who just wrote the text, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Brother Stephen Shigematsu, who just released his book on mindfulness and to heartfulness, that kind of shift. And have to honor the keynote speaker that spoke at the recent C-Mind conference, Jasmine. She contributed to the text Radical Dharma, talking about race, love, and liberation. So just wanted to kind of take a moment to just provide some of that context, how I thought about this work post-conference a few years ago, and some of the social forces right now that are at play that generate the polarization, which require us to develop new ways of coming to the conversation. And then also the kind of consciousness that has emerged out of trying to hold this 400-year period and popularized by the New York Times article. Now, one of the things that I've also been doing is going around the country, inviting people to walk through the timeline with me, and in community. These are some images of folks in Wichita, Kansas, in New York City, in Buffalo, New York, working with the timeline and it together in community, walking through this history. What we see is folks coming together to sit with this 400-year period that begins with this pernicious system of chattel slavery, but evolves into this more complex way of making inequality systemic for not just African Americans, but for other folk too. So what I've done, and what the National Committee has done, is to diffuse and share the timeline with communities throughout the entire country. So at this point, I've been able to work with about 1,000 to 1,500 people over the last 8 months in particular, walking them through the timeline and facilitating conversations around the timeline. And the 400 Years of Inequality National Committee has been able to even do that even more, as far as supporting communities with holding these, what they call observances. Now, what I want to do is provide you all with kind of a general structure that you can possibly use when facilitating the timeline. And I'll share with you now just kind of one sample agenda that I've used that has kind of a contemplative touch to it, but that has generated incredible levels of conversation and insightful messages from the community. So I usually begin with kind of an introduction and a framing to the 400 Years of Inequality timeline itself, but also like this larger moment we're in where we're trying to hold this 400-year period, and kind of talk a little bit about how I've done and facilitated the timeline before, and the enormity and the intensity that comes with the experience. We then kind of have a contemplative practice, and this can be in the form of a sitting meditation. It can be in the form of a movement meditation. Whatever form you feel like you're most comfortable facilitating, I invite folks to really generate a contemplative moment before diving into the timeline. It's very key that before we dive into experiencing the timeline, that we reset our minds, that we settle ourselves before diving into the timeline. Then what I require folks to do is to take a silent walk through the timeline. And that'll be about 15 minutes. just a silent walk through the timeline and allow people at least 15 minutes. I mean, sometimes I give them more. This sample agenda is stipulated and kind of organized around, like, if you were given about an hour and a half, 2 hours to facilitate a professional development workshop, or you were teaching a class, but 15 to 20 minutes in silence to walk through the timeline. Then after that period, I encourage folks to, in silence, to sit with what comes up for them and what came up for them during the silent walk. And the journaling can take on several forms. It can be a poem that you write. It can be a letter that you write. It can be a general journal and musings about what came up for you, what stayed with you, what historical moments stayed with you throughout this walk. In the past, people have written poems, people have written letters to ancestors, people have written letters to people in the timeline. So that allows folks to kind of like process what came up for them during the timeline. After the journaling, we do break silence, and we, in pairs, we provide them with about 10 minutes to just share. And usually there's an eruption of noise after this, because the timeline tends to be really evocative and sometimes jarring in regards to how it just shows us who we are as a country. I mean, if there's any one fundamental sentiment that is felt, is that this is us. This is us. In terms of how the timeline lays out this complicated history. Then I encourage folks to get in circle, and we get into a big restorative circle. And as the circle keeper, I facilitate the conversation as a restorative circle, sometimes with a talking piece, sometimes certainly with a centerpiece, and the centerpiece being the timeline. And for that 30 to 45 minutes, we as a community hold what came up for folks during the timeline experience. And we hold it together as a community and have a robust conversation around what came up for folks. And before the closing remarks, what we see over and over again is particular sentiments around our country and our country's school system's inability to teach history in a way that really represents what happened. And so you get an array of feelings around, wow, I didn't know this. Wow, I didn't know that happened. And then as a circle keeper, I end up taking some of the most salient points that were made throughout the circle, and I kind of weave those points together to make some concluding remarks. So this sample agenda really provides kind of a general structure for you to maybe consider and play with once you dive in and get the timeline yourself. What I wanted to also suggest is that we end with a practice, so that the design of the trajectory in terms of experience and timelines is kind of bookended by these practices, using contemplative practices to hold the immensity that is our history. So what I want to do now is invite you to explore the timeline in digital form. So I'm going to change the screen, and I'm going to bring the timeline up on the screen so that you can see it. So this is the timeline in digital form. This is the first half of the timeline. And I want you to envision this on the floor or on a wall, 4 foot by 20 foot long, laying out this incredibly complex history. And what I'll do now is I'll invite you to walk with me through this maze, through this history. So take a couple moments and breathe through this and just read some of the text. Take in some of the images. Begin to imagine yourself during one of these historical moments. Imagine yourself kind of gently bouncing from date to date. And let me take you on a journey through the timeline. A timeline that weaves so many histories together. Native American history, women's suffrage history, African American history, the labor movement. Gently take your eyes and bring it down to some of these moments in US history that shaped our country. And imagine if you were seeing this. Take a couple deep breaths for me. And I'm going to invite you to look at the second half of the timeline. This one kind of begins in 1607, and then the next, it's all part of the same timeline. So this one provides context for the last 200 years. Let's dive in. Let's dive in. So sit with this for a second. In 1949, Congress passed the Federal Housing Act, more popularly known as urban renewal, which was designed to eliminate blight from American cities by cleaning downtown slums, neighborhoods, often important African American ghettos. So in that little small moment, documenting the onset of this displacement of so many of our communities. Just so rich to be able to pull back and witness the incredible history, a history of struggle and a history of resistance. look at this. In 1917, 10,000 people, 10,000 African Americans and supporters marched down Fifth Avenue as part of a silent parade against lynching, race riots, and the denial of rights. So many people weren't aware of this. The onset of the Great Migrations. And if we just gently pull back and move on, a turn must be made. And we sit with the Women's Strike for Equality down Fifth Avenue. Kind of a coalition of multicultural communities coming together to demand equal rights for women. If you just come up a little to the top, you'll see the Kent State massacres and the violence that came out of that occurrence. And we begin to see how tumultuous the 60s were. And then we zoom out. And I'm going to bring you to more contemporary times, where Hurricane Katrina leaves New Orleans in an utterly vulnerable position. In 2009, Matthew Shepard is murdered because of his sexual orientation. In 2012, Trayvon Martin is shot. You have the evolution and the growth of the Occupy Wall Street movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and the infamous 2016 presidential election. The election of our current president and the subsequent Muslim ban. And finally, the timeline ends with what happened in Charlottesville. So the timeline in and of itself goes from 1607 to 2017, but it is a powerful resource for folks to explore our history, but not only that, to kind of deepen social justice oriented conversations. So my work has been at that intersection of supporting communities with deepening the dialogue around not just our history, but what can we do about it? So I'm going to bring you back to my PowerPoint now. Let's go back to present slide. Sorry, my apologies. So we have the timeline. And over the last year, the 400 Years of Inequality Committee has hosted a series of events nationally. And I just wanted to raise this one in particular because it was one of the most powerful that I was part of. And it had Reverend William Barber on it. And my God, what a powerful gathering at the Riverside Church. Stolen hands, stolen lands, from 1619 to a just future. And it is part of this call. I'm inviting all of you to print your own timelines and to gather folks together to explore our history, to explore what it means to be American at this particular point. I want to end by, because I want to spend some time answering some questions, but I want to kind of get a little more theoretical right now. So on the one hand, the timeline is an incredible tool to deepen dialogue around history, around issues of race, issues of class, issues of sexual orientation, in terms of how they've manifested historically. But there's a particular tension that is present in the contemplative education world and also in the mindfulness community. And I see those two kind of interchangeable concepts. For now, I'll just say that I consider mindfulness as kind of a subset. It's part of the larger umbrella of contemplative education. So right now, there's this interesting tension where we are all engaging in contemplative practices and mindfulness and doing it to increase our wellness and our focus and our productivity. Yet at the same time, there's this issue because we have things to do and structures to change. So we can't just remain in this contemplative and mindful space. Action needs to unfold. So we have in these two texts, for example, you have Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn's work in the mindfulness field. He's done incredible work with the mindfulness-based stress reduction and the popularization of mindfulness in American culture. And then you have coming up against that is critical scholars who are saying we need to go beyond reducing stress. We need to go beyond that, actually meet the social conditions that are at hand and change them. So Dr. David Forbes wrote a book recently called Mindfulness and Its Discontent. So I just want to kind of surface really briefly this interesting tension that's in the community. And that I think that practices and that tools like the timeline allow us to bridge these perspectives, where we on the one hand use the tools of mindfulness to generate well-being and reduce stress, but also infuse that process with a kind of more social justice oriented approach. And I'll give you, I've been fortunate enough to have both Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn and Dr. David Forbes as part of the 400 Years of Inequality timeline experience. This is what Dr. Kabat-Zinn said after walking through it. The 400 Years of Inequality timeline is an embodied, emotionally powerful, and highly meditative first-person experience in which we literally walk at our own pace past large canvases on the floor depicting a timeline of major events in US history, most of which we hardly ever learn anything about in schools or reflect upon as adults. Events that mandated inequality and legalized and institutionalized horrific injustices of all kinds. These legacies have huge and ongoing repercussions for all of us to this present day. And he's referring to me here, but really it's more of what the timeline generates. The angel's guidance in this reflective process gently invites us to learn and to heal individually and collectively. Hopefully it would also inspire us to act, to take a stand in little and big ways in the service of true equality and justice. Now I put that out there because I want to challenge all of us to use the timeline to bring folks together. And then this is David Forbes, the guy who wrote that text, beautiful text, that gives feedback to the Kabat-Zinns of the world. This was already a powerful experience even before it began. While walking around the timeline, not only by myself, but with others, and for all of us to be in a contemplative state, having first meditated, then reading and reflecting on some of the many troublesome and socially unjust, harmful events over the course of human history, reinforced a feeling of sadness as much as anger. I was personally struck by the recent events of the past 20 years. I began to see them as parts of a pattern and underscore the way that corporate media just reports them as random acts. And it's up to us to see them instead as part of a systemic pattern of oppression that we are all need to resist and transform together. Being in a more meditative and mindful state, heightened contemplating the timeline, as well as the debriefing afterwards, listening to my group partners who shared how the timeline highlighted their experience of acute discrimination in their lives. So I think that last point around how the timeline has been able to bring people together to process this really complicated history is the major point. And that might be a really kind of point where both of these scholars could meet, coming from kind of really different places, could meet and agree that this is how we could possibly move forward. So with all that being said, I want to create some time for questions. Honestly, this experience is so expansive that there's so much more that I can share. But I want to allow the last 15 minutes of this process to hold some of the questions that are in the community. I want to invite some of those questions right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angel, for sharing this with us. As Angel has said, this is now the time to submit your questions. I see some have already been coming in, but I would like to just take a moment or two to let folks formulate those questions and submit them. As I mentioned before, I will be reading these questions aloud and Angel will be answering them so that we can all hear them. So I'm just going to give you a moment or two to submit those questions now.
As you're formulating your questions, we will send the email out to everyone so that with the printing instructions of the timeline, I've been able to find a printer that can print 4x20-foot timelines for you for about $100. And it'll take about 5 days to get to you. They ship internationally and nationally. So after this webinar, all of you will receive an email with the printing instructions with the digital files attached to that email.
Yes, thank you for that reminder, Angel. We'll be sending all of the folks who registered, even if they weren't able to attend live, we'll be sending those resources in a follow-up email. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and read one of the first questions that came in. How do you tie in timeline inequality themes to workplace inequality issues in such areas as healthcare, IT, K through 12, and higher education, finance, etc.?
Yeah, wonderful question. And we've been able to facilitate the timeline in different contexts, in the health field, in the tech field. So the timeline itself, in terms of how we weave it, it's an incredible opportunity to get folks talking about structural inequality on a national level, and then have folks really reflect on how inequality impacts them personally. So what's happened is in different communities, I've seen that it deepens the understanding of how structural inequality is actually impacting people in the space that we're facilitating the timeline in. So basically, the timeline is a great tool for surfacing the ways in which inequality impacts the work setting or this context in which you're trying to facilitate it in. So in the tech sector, for example, having programmers and folks who design artificial intelligence walk through the timeline and then become aware of the history that they didn't know, and that ends up entering their calculus in terms of how they design these algorithms in the first place. In healthcare, allowing people to see this historical trajectory that now impacts how they have implicit biases that affect how they are providing services to particular populations. In K through 12 schools, the 400 Years of Inequality timeline, in the 400 Years of Inequality Committee has created a wonderful curriculum that's on the website, in the 400yearsofinequality.com website. So yes, in each and every one of those communities, the timeline has been used. And from my observations and from having facilitated conversations with those particular communities in the tech sector, in the health sector, and especially in education, what I've seen is that the timeline is a powerful tool for surfacing tensions, historical occurrences that then can guide the conversation towards how these systems live in our context.
Hmm. Yeah, and there were a lot of questions about how to use the timeline in different environments, in different kinds of institutions. So there was another question about how to use this with children. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that on the website there are some resources about
Yes.
how to use this with different age ranges.
Yes, there's a K through 12 curriculum written by the wonderful members of the committee. So you can have access to that on the website, in the 400 Years of Inequality website, and it guides folks how to use it across the K through 12 spectrum.
Hmm. That's great. So shifting a little bit, the next question I'd like to share out loud is that while the timeline certainly shows the history, but this question is about how do we connect it to the present moment and the decisions made on a daily life level?
Yes. So yes, the timeline is overwhelming. It has all kinds of historical artifacts and facts that kind of, in many cases happened in the past. But what you see is that throughout this kind of American experiment, what is a common theme is the structural inequality that we now all are experiencing it. So that what the language the committee uses is an ecology of inequality. And in supporting folks to navigating the timeline, there is this realization that there is a long-standing process of not just discrimination, but also of structural inequality that needs to be surfaced and needs to be seen. So in terms of how we change, in terms of how we transform, first there has to be in the community an acknowledgement that these things have happened. And unfortunately, we're living in a space and in a country that oftentimes does not teach history in ways that allow us to really see each other for the fullness and richness of our historical trajectory. And I'll also say that as a result of that, we have an American population that is not as well educated in terms of history. We struggle to process history. We struggle to metabolize history. So how we use this in our spaces for creating future change is we use it to look at the resistance that was required to get here in the first place, to kind of pay attention to the ways in which laws were passed to reinforce particular mechanisms of inequality. So I think for me, it really is an opportunity to see ourselves for what we are, who we are, and then begin to ask the question, what do the next 400 years look like?
Wow, thank you. Um, I'm going to sort of combine two questions and segment another because there's a lot of amazing questions coming up. I'm going to say now that we're probably not going to have a chance to talk about them all, but we will be sharing all these questions with you, Angel. So the first question is about including the experiences of other marginalized communities. So one of the questions was in particular about the timeline, including South Asian and Muslim experiences. And the other question was about, different marginalized groups such as people from different able positions.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, so the timeline has several different events, like the Disabilities Act of 1973, I believe, and some of the struggles of like community activists in that community struggling to kind of make headway. So there are kind of different reference points to those different communities, especially, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act that resulted in the barring of Asian communities from immigrating to this country. And also the Muslim community. So in the timeline, there are different points where those communities are represented, and also there are points where I think that we need to do a better job at including those communities in particular. But I think overall, when folks kind of walk through it, everybody, or at least all folks, have some kind of touch point in this larger tapestry of U.S. history.
That's great. Thank you. Another question is about bringing this into a classroom to support people of color. Or how do you see this being used in a classroom to support people of color who will have visceral reactions to some of these images or some of these moments in time?
Yeah, so I've been doing this with communities of color for about a year now, and all kinds of beautiful and tense things come up. I would definitely recommend reading Dr. Treleaven's book, Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, because before we engage in deep work on the timeline, we try to kind of really begin to settle ourselves, and also giving people the opportunity to, if it gets too intense for you, do not participate, do not practice. But overall, from all the communities of color that I've worked with, a few things come up. One, this incredible recognition of the afterlife of slavery and how those earlier institutions morphed into the prison industrial complex, and how those institutions still live with us, and how we have an incredible level of anti-Blackness in particular. So there's this post-traumatic stress that is evident in the timeline. Not only that, but there's a post-traumatic growth. There's this evidence of incredible resistance, incredible resilience that is evident. So in terms of communities of color, there's this processing of collective grief that happens often. And this kind of processing of this collective assault on the psyche of the collective body, if you were to say, of folks of color. So in terms of supporting community, it's a way to invite folks to think about the long-lasting legacies of these forces, but also the power of the human will to resist and respond. So for me, as a person of color, working with the timeline consistently, my back is straight, my back is arched. I know where we've been. I know what are the mechanisms in place that reproduce some of these social forces, and I am very clear that I will not participate in some of those institutions, and I'm trying to act in ways that disrupt those systems. One, by carrying out research that is kind of in a whole different paradigm. And so yes, you can use it as an opportunity to support folks of color, and you can use it as an opportunity to bring diverse communities to process who we are.
Thank you so much, Angel. So I know we're just about at time, but if you have the time, I'll ask one last question before we end.
Yeah.
It might be a little bit heavy and a little difficult to answer succinctly, but
That's fine.
it seems important.
Yeah, and then I'll make some concluding remarks after that.
Okay, great. So the last question we'll ask today is about how you bring this work into the academy, where it is so politicized. And so how do you balance that in institutions, educational institutions?
That's a powerful question. And I'll say that that's why contemplative practices and really using the power of the science of mindfulness to get in the door. So for me, in all the 1,000 people that have gone through, at least the ones that I facilitated, I'm not sure about the general committee, but in most of the higher education spaces that I've done this, there hasn't been much resistance because the way that I've positioned the conversation is really infused with the contemplative and thinking about resilience. So that it so that notions around polarization, politicization are are not as charged because we're not here to accuse anybody. We are just sitting with history. We're just sitting with history, and if done in a contemplative and a mindful way, the tenor of the conversation is quite different. And I'd also say that part of being in a polarized environment requires us to take risks and to experiment. So I want to experiment with the timeline, experiment, see what unfolds. I mean, we can't allow the polarization to stunt us into and numb us into not acting or not experimenting. So I think that we should experiment with the timeline, but also the way we approach the conversation has to be with ease and with joy, because I do this with joy. And I think that when those two are combined, I've had very limited resistance.
Yeah. I think that was just kind of a perfect full circle moment to end on. So thank you to the individual who submitted that question, and thank you, Angel, so much for your responses to the questions. There were many more, and like I said, I'll be downloading those and sharing them with you post webinar.
My email is on the screen. Please feel free to email me and ask any questions. This is a long-standing conversation. This is something that we all need to kind of step in. I am no expert. I am just a part of the community that is trying to really generate some attention to this. So, take it with you, use it, and then circle back and share any information you've kind of come across as far as data around facilitating it. We'd love to hear it.
Hmm. Thank you, Angel, again for sharing your work with us, and I hope to continue these conversations. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I just want to remind you all that this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the website soon. Our webinars are made possible by your support, so we invite you to make a donation and check out our extensive webinar archive at contemplativemind.org. You may not be aware of this since we have such a wide reach, but in actuality, the Center for Contemplative Mind is just 3 full-time staff members. So donations make a huge difference no matter what the size. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Angel, again. Take care.
Thank
Be
you.
well.